Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be talking about the wonderful 20th century poet Philip Larkin. Philip Larkin's poetry is sometimes dismissed as being too rudimentary, and I think that's a very unfair criticism, which I'm going to unpick in a bit more detail today. I'm going to show you why I think that criticism is unfair. I think there's so much more going on in Philip Larkin's poetry than might immediately meet the eye. I think they are deceptively, kind of enticingly perhaps, simple, and yet behind them there is much kind of technical layering that goes on into creating this apparent simplicity. To outline what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to start with some of the background and context. So I'm going to give a very quick introduction to Philip Larkin's and indeed mid-20th century writing more generally, the poetical style that is kind of typical of the mid-20th century, which to some extent you can say that Larkin embodies. I'm, for example, going to give a quick introduction to a literary movement called the Movement, which was sort of dominant in the 1950s. I'm then going to move on to quote Philip Larkin himself and to think about how Philip Larkin talked about his own poetical style and his own purposes in his writing, so what he's trying to do in his poems. To start with Larkin's background and contexts then. Larkin was born in 1922, so he was a teenager, late teenager, 17 or so, at the outbreak of World War II in 1939. So we can think of him really as a post-World War II writer, and in some sense what is typical of post-World War II writing in Larkin is the sense of detachment that really characterises, I would say, much of his poetry. To outline generally what Larkin's poetic style was, he was a poet of common experience and of everyday life, and his poetry is really rooted in those things, as I'll go on to talk about when I look at his own quotation and when he talks about his own poetry. More broadly, we can think of Larkin and the kind of literary movement that he was a part of as seeing the world stripped of romantic beauty and mystery and kind of Victorian, you might say, religiosity, stripped of those trappings and kind of the bare bones, you might say. He sees the world stripped in some sense of grandeur, of mystery, of the sublime, of a kind of reverential awe, that there is no mystery to this, that, you know, what you see is what's around you. You can see this perhaps as a kind of stripping of a hope for betterment or hope of improvement, the kind of stalling of the idea of progress, the march of progress, which had been really prevalent in the Victorian period, you know, that whatever happens, we are moving towards something better. The idea of progress, that humans are inevitably moving towards a better future. That comforting idea was really challenged in the 20th century by the two world wars and not seeming actually for things to be necessarily getting any better or for humanity to have progressed very far at all. So you can see Larkin and his kind of type of poets then as puncturing that idea of what you might call human self-aggrandizement. This idea that humans are progressing and getting ever better and ever, in some sense, more perfect. Or if you're a religious person, perhaps saying more close to the godly. So his poetry does not show the egotistical sublime as John Keats talked about William Wordsworth's poetry. The egotistical sublime is where the self or the soul or the ego is elevated to the human soul, is elevated to something that is sublime and awe-inspiring and verging to some extent on something divine. That is absolutely not a feature of Larkin's poetry at all. It's kind of self-consciously stripped of all of that self-aggrandizing. Instead, Larkin presents life, you might say, as drab, with parochial, limited concerns, that it's dull, that it's full of kind of false and or irrelevant meaning, that people, buy things to kind of fill up the meaninglessness of life. There's a real anti kind of commodity vein that runs throughout all of his poetry, and really you can say that it seems to focus on the mundanity of life, the mundane, the tedious, the boring. Philip Larkin is sometimes said to be part of a literary kind of group that was called The Movement in the 1950s. It sort of developed out of the 1950s, and that was a term that was coined in 1954. So other writers in this group included people like Kingsley Amis, who wrote Lucky Jim, and Tom Gunn, and Philip Larkin. But this term, the movement, was rejected by those who were classified as such, particularly Kingsley Amis, who wrote to Larkin to condemn the Spectator, which is where this term, the movement, was first coined. And the movement is sometimes aligned with the group that were named, the mid-20th century group that were named Angry Young Men, as they were so called. And what was it that was rejected by this group? What were they going against? What were they angry about? You can see it perhaps as a backlash against the kind of security of the cosmopolitan elites of the 1930s. So the surety, self-certainty of those in positions of power in the 1930s who had managed to walk the world into another world war. It's aggressively, or you can see the writing of this movement as being kind of aggressively sceptical of previous elites, previous certainties, previous groups of authority. You can see it then, to some extent, as a rejection of modernism, the early 20th century artistic, cultural movement, against what they would see as artificial pontificating or intellectual pretentiousness. So this is against the avant-garde and against kind of, I suppose you could call it classic romanticism, the ideals of the Romantic period. As I've said, the idea of the sublime, the idea of the awe-inspiring, particularly the awe-inspiring in nature. That in much of the poetry of Larkin and others of this time, there's a focus on the urban rather than the kind of romantic focus, or at least a Wordsworthian romantic focus on the Lake District and huge, broad descriptions of nature. In much romantic poetry, mountains and the sea and these kind of huge bodies of nature are kind of fundamental and very important to understanding their interpretation of the world. Not so for these writers in the mid-20th century who have more focused on kind of urban decay. So that's what they rejected. What then did they embrace? Well, much of the writing of this movement is ironical in tone. So it has a kind of knowing tone, a world-weary tone. Someone who sees the world and is unimpressed by it. And it's brutally, you could say, down to earth, pointedly unsentimental. It's kind of stripped back of all the decoration of life. And to some extent, you can see these ideas paralleled in other artistic movements of the time. So in architecture, for example, the style brutalism, you can see as aligned with this literary movement, which is kind of provocatively undecorative and strips all the decoration from building, and they become, as the name suggests, very brutal. So you see the kind of building materials, you see the concrete, you see the glass. It's all very stark. There's also an embracing of colloquial language, so everyday, ordinary language, rather than the kind of highfalutin poetic diction, which William Wordsworth called it, but stripping the kind of artificial pretentious, as they would see it, way of writing poetry and trying to get it into the language of the everyday, which is exactly what William Wordsworth talked about wanting to do in the lyrical ballads, hundreds of years before. But nearly 200 years, 150 years before. William Wordsworth had talked in the lyrical ballads about wanting to write poetry that was in the real language of men and rejecting what he saw as an artificial language that had gone, kind of characterised the poetry of the previous literary period, the 18th century. And that, to some extent, is what Philip Larkin and those like him writing at that time wanted to do too. It's just that what was artificial in their period was different from what was artificial about 18th century poetry. But still, the idea of stripping poetry down a bit of the intellectual pretentiousness of the elites who had been writing in the modernist period, as they would see it, and giving it back to the people and using colloquial language, using everyday language to do that. Getting back to Philip Larkin particularly then, there's a juxtaposition or a paradox, you could say, within his poetry that I think is really fascinating and which I'm going to be drawing out today and unpicking in a little bit more detail. So that is, on the one hand, that the content of his poetry seems to be about isolation and loneliness and the figure of the outsider not kind of fitting into this world that they see, ironically observing the absurdities of society and culture that's going on around the kind of central figure. And the narrative voice, although it's not always a narrative voice that's used, but that there's a sense of dislocation between society and the main figure in the poem. So on the one hand you have that, but then on the other hand you have Larkin's stated aim, which I will get on to talk about in a bit more detail in a minute. His stated aim of poetry, which is to set off the same experience in the reader that the central figure is feeling in the poem. So this juxtaposition then, this paradox, is that you have a kind of bleak, isolated figure, but at the same time there's a desire for others to feel the same way, set off the same experience in the reader. So there's a sense of the collective or the shared, or an idea of empathy that is present even in poems that are really about an isolated, lonely figure. This is what Philip Larkin says about his own poetry, his own poetic style, purposes of his writing. And this is from a BBC broadcast for the Overseas Service, which was broadcast on the 20th of August 1958. And I think it's revealing in terms of the way Larkin describes the individual in relation to the collective. What does Larkin say? "I have never claimed to know fully how or why I write poetry. It seems to me a skill easily damaged by self-consciousness, and poetic theory is not much good if it hinders the poet. If I must account for it, I think it would be best described as the only possible reaction to a particular kind of experience, a feeling that you are the only one to have noticed something." So here we have the sense of isolation, the only one, so the individual, the alone, the isolated. A feeling that you are the only one to have noticed something especially beautiful or sad or significant. And here again is the idea of feeling, which is really prevalent in Larkin's poetry, the prioritising of feeling, which might seem contradictory, given how bleak sometimes Larkin's poetry is described as being, but just this idea of shared feeling, something especially beautiful or sad or significant. Then there follows a sense of responsibility for preserving this remarkable thing by means of a verbal device that will set off the same experience in other people, so that they too will feel how beautiful, how significant, how sad. And the experience will be preserved. So this individual feeling that you are the only one to have noticed something will set off the same experience in other people. So the sense of the collective, of provoking the reader's sense of sympathy or empathy, so that they too, this idea of mutual feeling, they too will feel how beautiful, how significant, how sad, and the experience will be preserved. This does not mean it will always be a simple and non-intellectual thing. It may be complex, like perceiving the whole drift of a society, but the reaction is the same. So the treatment and reaction to the simple and to the complex is the same. So Larkin is saying here that he treats something that might be perceived as simple and something that might be perceived as complex. The process in which he deals with them is the same, so that you are the only ones who have noticed something, either something simple or something complex, and then your aim is to try and make other people feel that too, share in that feeling. Larkin continues, "Does this mean my poetry is over-personal in the sense of being narrow or shallow? Certainly, the poems I write are bound up with the life I lead and the kind of person I am." So one of the main criticisms, or a prevalent criticism of Larkin, was that all he wrote about was his own life. It was very kind of self-absorbed, very consuming, because he just only focused on a particular kind of experience, his own kind of experience. And this is Larkin's kind of defence of that criticism. But I don't think this makes them superficial. I think it improves them. If I avoid abstractions, so abstractions are just kind of theory removed from the material realm. So the ideas only, the metaphysical. It's kind of removed and unrooted from real life. So abstract thoughts, abstract theories. If I avoid abstractions, the grand philosophical thoughts of existence, etc., such as are found in politics and religion, it's because they have never affected me strongly enough to become part of my personal life, and so cease being abstractions. What he's saying here is that he avoids abstractions, or if I avoid abstractions, that he prefers to be rooted in the tangible, so what he can actually touch, and the quotidian, so the everyday, the commonplace, what is actually going on around him, what he can see and feel and smell and touch, etc., actually going on around him. And of course, that is going to involve a focus on the self, because, as he says, the poems I write are bound up with the life I lead and the kind of person I am. And you can only go through life in the body that you are in. And this, I think, is important, the second part of the sentence. They have never affected me strongly enough to become part of my personal life, and so cease being abstractions. So these grand ideas, the abstractions, these philosophical thoughts, only become relevant to Larkin when he feels them personally, when they affect him strongly, so that they stop being a kind of metaphysical thought somewhere up there unrooted in real life, and they become a part of his everyday life. Those contemplations become so kind of affecting that they are part of how he moves through the world. So he'll move through the world and he'll actually see something, and those, what might originally be called abstract thoughts, affect whatever is going on. So he sees a radio, or he sees a poster, like in Sunny Prestatin, one of the poems in Wits and Weddings, he sees a kind of poster or a nylon dress or whatever, and seeing that tangible actual thing in his personal life is affected then by those abstractions, but they have become part of his life. So he will have his ideas or theories of life filtered through the tangible, the quotidian, the real, the everyday, so that they are rooted at least in the real world, rather than being mere abstractions kind of floating above existence, floating above life. I suppose the kind of response I am seeking from the reader is, yes, I know what you mean. Life is like that. So a real focus on reality, on life as it is lived. And also this idea of fellow understanding, that his poetry is designed to provoke in the reader a sense of sympathy and empathy. Yes, I know what you mean. I understand you. So even though it might seem about being the only one to have noticed something, what it's about is provoking a sense of community and fellow feeling in the reader by saying, yes, I know exactly what you mean. I feel that way too. So there are two things I think are essential. That feeling of connection between the figure in the poem and the reader, but also on the focus on lived life as an experience. So universal humanity and an understanding of what life is actually like. I would say two kind of central tenets that Larkin is talking about here of the purpose of his writing. I suppose the kind of response I'm seeking from the reader is, yes, I know what you mean, life is like that, and for readers to say it's not only now, but in the future, and not only in England, but anywhere in the world. So this is what I was saying, this idea of universal humanity. And that's a lot of people. That's, not only kind of those who exist now, but those who exist at any time, and not only who have this particular cultural understanding, so not only those in England, but those anywhere in the world. So he's really opening it out to a kind of essence of what he wants to capture is an essence of lived life. Yes, life is like that. I avoid abstractions. It's because they have never affected me strongly enough. And that's the thing I think is often overlooked in Larkin, is that Larkin really is a poet of feeling. One of the things that he admires most, for example, about Thomas Hardy, the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century novelist and poet, was that he promoted a sense of feeling, that feeling was the essence, really. That feeling is the essence of good writing. So Larkin said of Hardy, Hardy taught me to feel rather than to write. So this is going back to the idea of the movement, and what they were trying to go against is the idea of, for Larkin at least, feeling coming first when you're writing, rather than the writing coming first, which seems a bit of an odd thing to say, but by writing coming first, what that means is being kind of consumed by the idea about writing first and feeling being secondary. That idea of writing coming first is the kind of pretentiousness that leads to, or at least for those who feel this way, the kind of pretentiousness that leads to a very decorative kind of writing that is consumed with itself and with what writing is, and effectively style over substance. And what Larkin likes in Thomas Hardy is the promotion of feeling. And he continued to say, Hardy taught me to feel rather than to write, and to have confidence in what one felt. I avoid abstractions. They never affected me strongly enough for me to write about them. He's the poet, Larkin is the poet of feeling, or at least, if not descriptive feeling, it's more particularly, I would say, a poet of feeling about ideas, or feeling about those abstractions, about the theories of life. So taking those grand ideas and kind of reducing them and distilling them to a kind of small everyday experience, which doesn't seem to be very much at first. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you've liked the video, then do please press the like button. It does help me out in YouTube's algorithm. And I'd love to know your response to Philip Larkin, his poetic style,